Hello, thank you for joining us today. I'm Dr. Sharon Roberts, Chief K-12 Impact Officer of the State Collaborative on Reforming Education. On behalf of SCORE, we're honored that you have chosen to spend time with us today as we share the results from our most recent report, Early Grades Literacy Success for All Students, a Coherent Path Forward. I can personally tell you that there's almost nothing I would rather do than spend time engaging with practitioners on the topic of early grades literacy. And today, I'm even more excited to focus on conversations on students who need the most support to succeed with reading in our state. While you're with us today, we want to make sure that you have a chance to dig deeper into the findings of our latest report and to hear from two districts who are choosing to make their practice public by sharing their change journey with you. However, we also want to make sure that you have the opportunity to consider the nuances around what a new and more integrated framework for academic intervention could look like, and to explore the tools and resources that SCORE has released alongside the report that may be able to help you to actually make these shifts right now. As you listen to any portion of the webinar, please also feel free to submit questions. There will be a time for Q&A following the district presentations. And for any question we can't address during our time together, a SCORE team member will prioritize following up with you by email after the webinar. Before we dig into the findings of this report, we need to begin our time together by situating this report in the context of Tennessee's early literacy story. I will do my best to quickly walk through decades of chapters, starting with Tennessee's commitment to delivering on deep academic support. Nearly 1 decade ago, in 2014, Tennessee released its first response to intervention framework. This document outlined a process by which districts should identify and support students who were demonstrating a need for a more targeted support beyond core instruction. It outlined 2 tiers of support known as Tier 2 and Tier 3, where students will receive small group support for between 30 to 60 minutes a day. Then only 2 years later, in 2016, Tennessee refreshed its intervention framework to reflect a deep focus on strong core instruction as the foundation for any intervention approach. Without strong core instruction, it's impossible to identify students who are actually struggling to achieve success with core instruction alone. As a result of these 2 steps, every public school in Tennessee now has between 45 minutes to 1 hour set aside every single day for targeted small group support and a deep belief that strong core instruction is essential. Then while it looks like there's a big gap between 2016 and 2021, these 5 years were actually full of learning. And obviously, for the last 2 years of this block, Tennessee worked hard to respond to the COVID pandemic by prioritizing the safety of our students and educators, as well as a continuity of education services. But while all that was happening, a group of Tennessee districts known as the LIFT Network partnered to pilot high-quality instructional materials and consistent access to foundational skills instruction for students in grades K through 5. Learning as a field continued to evolve within and around Tennessee that pointed to the power of explicit and systematic foundational skills instruction as the research-backed approach for teaching reading, and the power of high-quality instructional materials to derive equity and grade-level rigor during the core instructional block. The next chapter of our state story is the Tennessee General Assembly's special session in the fall of 2021. All of the elements we just discussed were instrumental in informing the state's policy priorities. So while many students across our nation were still home receiving instruction virtually, Tennessee's policymakers convened for a special session to enact sweeping legislation, including mandatory adoption and purchase of high-quality instructional materials in K-5 literacy, submission of district-level foundational skills literacy plans, training for all certified and uncertified staff supporting early literacy, reading instruction and our education preparation programs across the state that would emphasize explicit and systematic foundational skills instruction. And finally, to address the learning loss experienced as a result of the pandemic, the establishment of Tennessee All-Cores to ensure districts had state-level guidance and funding to launch new high-dosage tutoring programs that research was pointing to as a lever for student growth. Taken together, these policies established an early literacy foundation in Tennessee intended to ensure that students would consistently have access to research-aligned reading instruction and materials in their core literacy blocks. They also offered targeted funding for small group intervention support for Tennessee students who are academically behind in early grades literacy. And most importantly, these policies appear to be working. While COVID wreaked havoc on learning in Tennessee and across the nation, by the spring of 2022, student learning loss in literacy in Tennessee was recovered, and proficiency was even higher on average than the pre-pandemic rate. This trend has continued into 2023, where we now have our highest rate of literacy proficiency since raising our standards. Despite all of this incredible work and support, a deeper look at ELA proficiency trends in Tennessee for 3rd through 8th graders reveals the percent of students scoring in the lowest performance category has not yet returned to pre-pandemic rates, and in fact was growing between 2018 and 2022. Unfortunately, these results indicate that there's more work to be done to support students who are the furthest behind and beg a deeper look at how the strong literacy policies and practices may or may not be serving all students. But this is where we believe Tennessee could begin its next chapter in early literacy, a chapter that brings every single one of these tremendous policies and practices together in an integrated way for students in Tennessee, and in a way that is truly at the cutting edge across the nation. Tennessee schools have an opportunity to imagine and create a world where every adult in the building who supports students with literacy has a deep knowledge of the same high-quality instructional materials and assessments. In this new paradigm, all staff, certified general and special educators, interventionists, paraprofessionals, and tutors are on the same page about how to help and monitor the progress of each student. For students, they experience coherent support from a team of adults who know exactly which foundational skills, topics, text, and tasks that students need to master to work toward grade-level literacy success. We now have the structures and supports to make this a sustainable practice. Rather than contracting with a wide range of vendors for high-dosage tutoring or additional materials and assessments, schools may be able to use the high-quality instructional materials and the people that they already have in their buildings to serve students well. The report, district stories, recommendations, and resources we will share with you today highlight what we believe is a coherent path forward for early literacy success for all students in Tennessee. With that, it's my pleasure to turn this over to Karen Lawrence, our Senior Director of Networks and Partnerships at SCORE, to share the highlights from our paper, and then to introduce you all to 2 Tennessee districts we're featuring on today's call.
All right. Thank you, Sharon. And thank you everyone so much for being here today. It's an hour-and-a-half long webinar, but I'm biased, I think well worth it. So thank you for being here today. What I would like to share with you today and how I'll use the next 30 minutes is to give a bit of context around how this new early literacy report at SCORE came to be, but then also to share with you some really exciting findings that we think are compelling enough to support this kind of dramatic shift in the way that Tennessee supports its youngest students with learning how to read. So where I'll begin is asking you to imagine a scenario with me, a scenario that SCORE was able to observe over the last year as we engaged with 6 districts in what we called our Accelerate Network, where we were really focused on helping those districts think about how to integrate the high dosage tutoring structure that you just heard about that came about following our special session in 2021, how to integrate that into the work they were already doing in this tier 2, tier 3 setting, as all of these supports were really designed to offer small group support to students who are behind. So what did we observe as districts were trying to do all of these things together at the beginning of last school year? So imagine the scenario. In a Tennessee classroom last year, 5 second graders required extra support in literacy. Per Tennessee guidelines, 3 of them scoring between the 26th to 40th percentile on a literacy assessment received high dosage tutoring for 30 minutes, 3 times a week, using the same materials from their core instructional block and with support in each of those sessions from a certified teacher. The other 2 scoring much lower between the 1st and 10th percentile during the beginning of your universal screener were placed in a setting known as tier 3. They received literacy support as well for 45 minutes every single day, so more than the high dosage tutoring group. However, this group worked to improve their literacy skills independently with a computer program, one that did not align to the high quality instructional materials that were being used in their core literacy block. So after observing this, we thought to ourselves, what if we tried to take this scenario, extract it out of the education setting for a minute and relate it to something different? And we chose basketball. So this is kind of the interactive portion of the webinar. I'm not formally going to poll you all, but I would like you to all imagine that you want to be great at basketball and that you're going to attend the SCORE School of Basketball, where we are going to make sure that by the end of your year in our school, that there's 6 skills you're going to be able to do. So I'll read these 6 skills to you. And as I'm reading them to you, please count to yourself how many of these you feel confident that you could already do. So this is your beginning of the year assessment at our school. The first question, I know what a layup is. So give yourself a yes if you know what that is. I can dribble a ball for 3 minutes. I can dribble a ball between my legs while walking. I could make 1 out of 2 layup attempts. I could make 1 out of 3 free throw attempts. And I have made 2 or more 3-point shots in my lifetime. Game or practice will count here. So think about how many yeses you have to those questions. And once you have that number, I want you to place yourself into one of these support settings. Everyone will spend time in core instruction with the head coach, but depending on how much support you need, you're also going to receive some extra support on your basketball skills. So take a minute, identify, are you going to get support in core instruction alone? Are you going to also get some tutoring? Are we going to help you through tier 2? Did you get 1 to 2 questions where you could say yes? Or are we going to help you in tier 3? And if you're in tier 3, that's totally fine. 0 skills is an okay place to start at the beginning of the year. So decide where you're going to get support. And then now I'm going to explain to you what the support is that you're going to receive so that at the end of this year, you can proficiently do all 6 of those things. So for those of you who are already stellar at basketball, congratulations. Welcome to the SCORE School of Basketball. You are going to stay with the head coach every single day, all day long, to continue to refine your already stellar skills. By the end of the year, you're just going to be amazing at basketball. For those of you who could say yes to half of the questions, you are going to go to tutoring. And during tutoring, you'll be coached by someone who has had some training to practice the 6 skills with you. They may or may not use the same materials and methods as the head coach, but they might. You'll be placed in a group of 3 students for that extra support, and you'll spend 90 minutes a week getting that strategic small group support. For those of you who are going to get support through our tier 2 setting, you are going to be coached by an assistant coach. They're going to assess you again, but on different skills. And then they're going to use different materials and different approaches to help you get better at the basketball skills that we have before you. You're going to be in a group that's a little bit bigger than the tutoring group. You're going to be with 5 students, and you're going to spend 150 extra minutes a week in that group. And then for those of you who really need a lot of support with basketball, we are here for you. You're going to use a computer program to learn more about basketball. And your head coach will get data from the computer program on how you're progressing, and you'll spend between 225 to 300 minutes a week with this program. So, not at all to make light of how we are currently serving students, but when we create this analogy between how we're supporting our students who need the most help to something like basketball, the disconnect becomes a little bit more clear. If you wanted to be an excellent basketball player, you would, or shoot free throws like a pro, you would stand behind the line, shoot at a regulation height goal with a regulation size ball. You would not be in a tennis court. These are the kinds of things that when we're working with students who really need the most help to meet those same grade level standards that everyone else is working to meet at the end of the year, how can we think differently about how we offer them intense support? Additionally, there are really some unintended consequences of this sort of support approach. So while assigning struggling students to new settings, assessments, materials, and staff at the first sign of weakness is very well intentioned and follows a clear logic model that says something along the lines of, you are struggling in core instruction, you must need something different. That makes sense. However, what happens in that logic model is that students who need the most support with grade level content systematically experience something different. School teams receive mixed signals about student progress with misaligned assessments and materials. Educators working with the same student experience increased barriers to collaboration. And then students ultimately may be put on a path to more intensive intervention or identification for special education before they ever receive extended, deep support with aligned high quality instructional materials. So under current conditions, students in Tier 3 in Tennessee, so those who need the most support, may be spending nearly the equivalent of an entire day of learning each week that does not leverage the high quality adopted materials used in their core instructional literacy block. So how did we get here? As Sharon described, it's been a 10-year history of work in Tennessee that actually has put us in an incredible spot, and you'll get to see that in a minute. Because I'm going to walk you through some analysis results that we think are really exciting. But before I show you the results of the analysis, it's really important to understand all of the nuances and differences between these settings that we've been talking about here. So what is really the difference between high dosage tutoring Tier 2 and Tier 3 in terms of guidance? If you're a district trying to make sure that you're sort of following the letter of guidance you've been given, what does that look like and feel like for a student? And then as you're making instructional placement decisions for students. So what you see here is a summary of guidance that districts in Tennessee today are trying to follow for their students that they've identified as needing more help. So I'm going to describe each of these settings to you around some key elements of the type of support design that we have for students who are behind, and then move into some findings. So for the first program element, how do we currently identify students for high dosage tutoring or Tier 2 or Tier 3? At the beginning, middle, and end of the year, Tennessee requires that students are administered an early literacy screener. The results of that screener are really placed at a premium in terms of deciding where a student should receive support. So if a student scores below the 40th percentile, but kind of in this approaching proficiency area, so above the 26th percentile, somewhere in that range, they are usually identified for high dosage tutoring. For a student who scores below the 25th percentile, they're going to be assigned typically to either Tier 2 or Tier 3. So with the thinking being high dosage tutoring is slightly more intensive because it's small group support compared to just core instruction. Tier 2 is more intensive than tutoring, and Tier 3 is more intensive than Tier 2. So how are these structures currently intended to be staffed? So for high dosage tutoring, and remember, this is a relatively new setting for Tennessee, coming on the heels of the pandemic, legislated in 2021. So the requirements to be a high dosage tutor are to have completed trainings that were developed by the state of Tennessee, learning how to be an effective tutor. For tier 2 and tier 3, instructors should be highly trained in the selected set of intervention materials that they are going to deliver. And where possible, it should be taught by a certified educator. That is not always happening on the ground due to capacity, but that is the guidance. This little arrow you can see I've highlighted in yellow because the differences here we think are a really key component of the results that you're going to see from our analysis in a minute. So what materials should be used across these settings? So for high dosage tutoring, Tennessee districts are following guidance that they should be using high quality materials that do align with core instruction content. But then moving into tier 2 and 3, the guidance becomes that schools should be using systematic, scientifically research-based interventions that target students' identified area of deficit and that produce reliable and valid results. And that sounds incredible. But we're going to show you some results that we think this switching of materials actually may be having a bigger impact on student growth than we think in a negative way. So then what is the maximum group size in these different settings? High dosage tutoring, there should not be, for early grades literacy, what we're talking about today should only be between up to 3 students for each adult. In tier 2, guidance is still actually in place that says those groups can be bigger. Even though students do technically need more support in tier 2, the groups are bigger. However, you'll see that they meet more frequently. And then in tier 3, it aligns to high dosage tutoring that it should be no larger than a group of 1 to 3 adults. In terms of how frequently they meet, high dosage tutoring, current guidance says that students should receive high dosage tutoring support at least 2 times a week for between 30 to 45 minutes. So max of kind of 90 minutes a week. Tier 2 is 30 minutes every day. And tier 3, depending on the grade level that we're talking about for today, it ranges between 40 minutes a day to 60 minutes a day. And then how long are students in each of these settings? So for high dosage tutoring, students should be spending a year in that support setting per the kind of funding and grant requirements that were also part of the package around high dosage tutoring coming out of 2021. And then for tier 2 and tier 3, there is no specified duration, no number of progress monitoring data points before recommending either a change in the frequency of support, the interventions that are actually provided, so the content, the provider, the time of day, or to refer a student for special education evaluation. So these are the big differences between these settings in Tennessee right now. And I'm going to show you what we think kind of the impact is of currently of this structure. So SCORE was very just lucky over the last year to have 6 districts be willing to just go deep on this topic. Again, response to intervention has been around for a decade. High dosage tutoring is something that districts across Tennessee are working to implement, launch, get off the ground. It is now part of a package that they're offering to students to make sure that the students who are below proficient can be promoted from 3rd grade to 4th and from 4th to 5th. So districts are working really hard to make all of this happen. And we had 4 districts over the course of the last year who said, you know, I want to dig in deeper and learn more here about how these settings are making an impact on students in my district and think about how to integrate all of these systems in a whole new way. So these 4 districts in Tennessee shared their data with us to investigate the extent to which students in 1st through 3rd grade literacy grew throughout the 22-23 school year across different support settings. So what you'll see here are the 4 main settings: core literacy instruction, high dosage tutoring, tier 2 and tier 3. And then what you see on the left are the beginning of year percentile performance range bands that are associated with the typical cutoff score for being assigned to one of these settings. So in general, students who score below the 10th percentile, guidance sort of moves them into tier 3. Between the 11th and 25th percentile, general guidance would put them into tier 2. Students who score between the 26th to 40th percentile, general guidance puts them into high dosage tutoring. And then students scoring above the 40th percentile, generally there's not guidance that directs them to any specific place, though a school may decide that they need some kind of support. So the power of this analysis comes from the fact that the 4 districts we were working with did have variance in where they placed students. So they didn't just have every student below the 10th percentile in tier 3. They actually had them spread across all 4 settings, some of them even just in core instruction alone not getting additional support outside of that setting. And then same with every other percentile band down. We were able to really look at the average growth by start point in the year and by setting. And that's really the power of this analysis, that we were able to look at really the lowest performing students. Did they fare better in one or more of these settings? So while we can think about growth across all 4 of these settings, the factor that we really want to focus in on is this change in materials. So when you think about it that way, you can actually group these 4 settings into 2 larger buckets, which is think about core literacy instruction and high dosage tutoring really hanging together because they use the same materials across settings. So when a student leaves that core instructional classroom to go get their small group support, they're using the same stuff. But then think about tier 2 and tier 3 as hanging together, because when that student leaves core instruction to go get their targeted support in a small group every single day, they are using something different in each of those settings. So that's what we're going to take a look at, is what is the average growth across these settings when materials are changed or the same, depending on where a student started at the beginning of the year. So I'll give you just a second to look at these findings. And what you can see is that when these 4 districts looked at the average growth trends for nearly 16,000 students in 1st through 3rd grade literacy, and this data right here is for students without disabilities, and I'm going to show you the same kind of graphic for students with disabilities or those who have individualized education plans. But they found that on average, getting core instruction alone or getting small group support with high quality instructional materials that align to core instruction resulted in the most growth for students. When you zoom in to that lowest performing group, so students who would normally be flagged for tier 3 instruction, you can see that receiving consistent small group support that leverage aligned materials resulted in 3 times as much growth when compared to their peers who actually were assigned that year to tier 3. For students who started the year performing in the 11th to 25th percentile range, who would normally be flagged for assignment to tier 2, results also show that placement in core instruction alone or aligned high dosage tutoring settings were the best placements for them. And same with students who started the year in the range, the 26th to 40th percentile range, which would normally be flagged for high dosage tutoring. And then the last thing I'll point out on this particular slide is that assignment to tier 3, so that's about 45 to 60 minutes every single day using different materials, resulted in an average decline over the course of the year for the students in this analysis. But we also need to talk about another sort of reason that the response to intervention framework was created, and that was for special education. So special education, and the way that that ties into the response to intervention framework is that Tennessee really wanted to pursue a strong path forward in not waiting for students to fail, not just identifying students with a disability because no one intervened and they were failing. They wanted to have a really strong process in place to say, this student is struggling, we're going to offer support, we're going to offer more intensive support. And if that student is still struggling, then maybe it is time to evaluate them for an individualized education plan. So by offering students the small group support, it was designed to help school teams really identify in a more systematic way students who may have a specific learning disability. So the process being at a very high level, students are identified for tier 2 or tier 3 using universal screener data. They then receive support for some amount of time when we think about the guidance using a variety of materials and assessments that are different from core instruction. That support approach could be changed at any time. And if they don't show progress on nationally normed assessments given every couple of weeks at the same rate as their peers who are not receiving this support, then the assumption is they may need to be evaluated for special education. So I'm displaying this graphic to you. And for those of you who are deep in the field here, and I'll say that my background is also in special education, look at this graphic and think to yourself, what is wrong with this picture? Because there is something wrong with that picture. Essentially, this is actually the accurate view of special education. As a field and by law, we know that placement of students with disabilities occurs across all settings. There are students with IEPs who are only being served in core instructional settings and experience success because they are receiving targeted great accommodations to make sure that they are successful in that classroom without being pulled out somewhere else. And we also know that special education is not a designation at a certain percentile level on a universal screener, even over time. And really, as we think about this idea of having a system of academic intervention, of supporting students to catch up, this really should be about offering students a path back to core instruction rather than changing materials and assessments and settings and educators really quickly, and maybe even before a student has an IEP. So here are some other things that we need to think about when we start talking about students with IEPs. Their support by federal law should be driven by the principle of least restrictive environment. So from federal IDEA legislation, this really just means that they should be in a general education setting as much as possible. Instructional decision-making for students with IEPs should reflect accommodations or modifications. And accommodations really are intended to adjust how students are taught or expected to learn, whereas modifications really adjust what students are taught or what they are expected to learn compared to their general education peers. And here's another number that I think we all need to really contend with in Tennessee in particular, was that 99% of our students, all of them in grades 3 through 12, including students with IEPs, take end of year assessments that are aligned to the same grade level standards as their peers. So when we start to visualize special ed in this way as falling across all of these settings, receiving support in different ways that allows them to, for the most part, engage with accommodations that are going to help them re-access core instruction, and that they actually are working towards the very same end of year assessment as their peers, we need to continue to think about, so what sort of services should we be offering them in this continuum of placements? So thinking about this way to think about students with IEPs, I want to show you the same kind of analysis that we just walked through for students without IEPs. For those same 4 districts who went on this journey with us over the last year, they identified for us the students in that same data set, 1st through 3rd grade early literacy, who did have IEPs. So that's the only students that are included in this data set. And I'll tell you right now that this graph, this analysis, almost did not make it into our report because the ends were and are too low to say anything about the growth of students with IEPs across these settings. So even though there were 3,000 students, they were spread apart, and we in particular wanted to look again at what we think made this analysis so powerful, which is looking by starting point in the year and then by setting to see how much growth happened. So we realized we couldn't make any sort of claim about the impact of small group coherent instruction on students with IEPs. But then we realized we saw something deeper, that actually maybe was the issue at play here. So out of the over 3,000 students in these 4 Tennessee districts that had IEPs, only 109 of them were placed in an instructionally coherent high dosage tutoring structure. And then when we look to see sort of, okay, what's happening with the lowest performing students, not even using that cut that we were able to do with other students where it's let's look at the 1st through 10th percentile. We weren't even able to look at that N size at all, but looking below the 25th percentile, only 20 students out of the 1,957 that were in that bucket of performance over the course of last year, only 20 of them experienced it. So given what we know and just discussed around least restrictive environment, what students are held accountable to at the end of the year, this idea of accommodations versus modifications, we know that Tennessee needs to do more to think about how are we serving students with IEPs first with deeper support on core instructional materials. So at a high level, we think there are 4 big trends that came out of this case study with these districts. So students who started the year furthest behind grew the most on average in a high dosage tutoring structure that leveraged high quality core instructional materials. Students between the 11th to 40th percentiles also experienced more growth on average in a high dosage tutoring structure that leveraged high quality core instructional materials or when placed in core instruction alone. And then placement in tier 3 resulted in an average decline in performance for students scoring above the 10th percentile and a similar rate of growth as placement in core instruction alone, so no additional support, for students scoring below the 10th percentile. And students with IEPs made less growth than their peers without IEPs in every performance band on average, but participation rates in high dosage tutoring for students with IEPs was far too low for analysis potentially signaling a barrier to access for this group. And for those of you who are from Tennessee on the call, this is maybe pretty specific to us, again, given the history lesson we got from Sharon, but we think there's actually a really big finding here that has pretty major implications for how we serve kids, our capacity, our resources, our materials, to have this sort of coherent path forward that we're trying to talk about today. In simple terms, this means that for students who are furthest behind, learning could be maximized by providing them instructionally coherent small group support through a high dosage tutoring structure, which takes 90 minutes per week compared to the 150, 300 minutes currently allocated for tier 2 and tier 3 structures. And that our students with IEPs specifically should have access to HDT, high dosage tutoring, as a support structure to align to the principle of least restrictive environment in a school's continuum of supports. So what do we mean when we say instructional coherence, and what is our opportunity here? Tennessee has an opportunity to apply all those policies and practices around foundational skills instruction, high quality instructional materials, high dosage tutoring as a structure that we've defined and funded to create instructionally coherent small group support for students in early grades literacy. And I'm not sure if Jamila Newman is on the call today, but she is a dear friend from TNTP who wrote a white paper for them over the last couple of years, really focused in on instructional coherence. And this is the definition that we also feel is really strong as well here at SCORE, which is that instructional coherence ensures that every element of an instructional program and its strategies, from core instruction to interventions to extended time, work together to advance the same set of grade level student experiences. It encourages educators and leaders to align their multi-tiered systems of support in ways that will accelerate learning for all students. So what could that really look like in Tennessee if we defined this new, broader vision for instructionally coherent small group support? Here's what we think that would mean for kids. Whenever a student in Tennessee is identified as needing support beyond the core literacy block, Tennessee will ensure that the experience they have is aligned to the research on reading, focused on the content and assessments from high quality materials used in core instruction, staffed to ensure students receive support from personnel who have been trained on early literacy instruction and core instructional materials and assessments, prioritized for students who demonstrate the greatest academic need, because that is what we saw in our data, and then structured at a minimum to current research on high dosage tutoring for early grades literacy, which right now, and again, that research is continuing to evolve, but right now that would mean 3 times a week for 30 minutes in groups of no more than 4 students when that tutor is trained. So this isn't fully about high dosage tutoring. This isn't really about tier 2 or tier 3. We really think this is about instructionally coherent small group support and not asking students in the morning to work on A says ah, and then in the afternoon to work on D says duh. Or the way I like to think about it right now is, if those of you on this call, if you really are just absolutely a PC person like I am, but in the afternoon, someone gave you a Mac and expected you to do the same amount of work, or if you're an iPhone user and someone gave you an Android, right? It's a computer, it's a phone, it's all the same, but it's not the same, right? We're being asked to even just use a different interface. The buttons have been moved, right? And all of those things as adults would throw us off and allow us to not do our best work. And as we think about changing the practice materials and the interfaces for students between morning and afternoon, and even more so, potentially changing the scope and sequence of their learning for our students who are furthest behind, asking them to actually learn maybe 2 sounds in one day instead of 1, like students in core instruction would be doing who are higher performing, then these are the things that we're really talking about here. But we think that Tennessee is in this incredible position to leverage actually all of the systems, structures, and content and staff that we have right now to make this happen. We think the path forward to doing that is really a lot about clarifying terms, clarifying response to intervention as the process for identifying students who need support, for progress monitoring, for sending notes home to families about how their student is performing over time. These are process elements that wrap around how we execute support for students who demonstrate that they need that targeted and structurally coherent small group intervention. Then, if we identify high dosage tutoring as the structure, it's written into our policies around offering high dosage tutoring to our 3rd and our 4th graders for promotion. It's backed by research in terms of that consistency, the size, the timing. So identifying our process, identifying the name of the structure so that schools aren't trying to implement high dosage tutoring and tier 2 and tier 3 at the same time, really as a function of a name more than anything else. They're all 3 small group support structures. So let's name one. Let's call it tutoring. Then if we use universal screeners as our initial assessment at the beginning, middle, and end of the year as a guidepost for which students may need more support, but then follow that up with use of high quality instructional assessments from the materials that teachers are familiar with that can actually really pinpoint exactly where a student needs help, not provide a general direction of which students do or do not need help, but which students have actually mastered what's been taught to them or really do have gaps. And let's do that for all students at the beginning of the year. And then if we use our adopted materials as the content for those small group sessions, materials that students are familiar with, see every day, can just build on and dig in more deeply to, let's use that. And then if we can leverage our amazing educators who are already here, already working with kids, already know these students, know the materials, know the assessments, have this time in the day where support is already integrated. Let's use them to really make these coherent small group structures just come to life for our students and connect back to what they're learning in core to where they're getting that small group help with the grade level standards and with the help that they need. If we do that, we can believe we can offer this kind of support actually to even more students under current capacity, current funding. So if you're an educator on the call, I want to just go into a little bit more detail of what this could really look like on the ground in terms of its implementation and what it would really mean to align our intervention approach also to the research on reading, which we know in terms of the kind of 2 strands of reading at a high level is foundational skills instruction, learning to read, and then reading comprehension, where you're reading to learn. So imagine at the beginning of the year, you administer your universal screener to your students, and you come away with really critical data to see generally who's on track and who's falling behind. But then you follow that up with the really specific skills-based assessments that are from your high-quality instructional materials to find out exactly where those gaps are. And maybe the gaps that you're seeing actually are just things students haven't been taught yet. So maybe you choose to stop the RTI process right there for that student. But maybe that curriculum embedded assessment from the materials offers you more information that shows you students really are behind. Then we get to apply what we know about the research on reading. If students have a gap or have fallen behind with foundational skills instruction, let's offer them support, not just because of their score on the universal screener. Let's offer them really targeted support in a group that's focused on a particular skill area, CVC words, blending digraphs, multisyllabic words, whatever it is. Let's go deep with the same interfaces and materials that students are used to. And let's say that you give that curricular assessment and you find that students don't have foundational skills gaps, but they are still scoring poorly on the universal screener, maybe on some other portion of the assessment that you've given, and you want them to have targeted small group support. It won't focus on skills. It's going to focus on the texts, the topics, the tasks, the discussion prompts, the writing samples that need to happen as a part of core instruction. Students are just going to get to go deep with targeted support on those things that they need to meet grade level standards. So I'm about to stop talking because everything I'm saying is theoretical, hypothetical, what if we did this? But the great news is we have 2 districts that are on with us today who actually have started trying to do this. So I'm going to turn it over to them. But before I do, I want to tell you just a little bit about the process that they went through as they were attempting to do some of the things that we just described. They really started last year, probably where many of you are right now, right? But just considering this idea of instructional coherence and starting with a theory of change, that if we can think about instructional coherence, what that would mean for tutoring, for tier 2, for tier 3, for core instruction, which kids, which content, do we use a cut score, which staff, which assessments are we going to use? Like, let's get that vision solid around how all of these supports integrate together. Let's think about that. And then finding opportunities to serve more students during the day by reviewing master schedules and staffing to try to make that vision happen at scale. So let's get the vision, let's think about our staffing and scheduling. And then once we really understand what all that looks like, how much will it cost us? We want to do this work at scale. So how much will it cost us to live out an instructionally coherent vision for small group support at scale. They had help from 3 wonderful technical assistance providers. So TNTP really supported these districts with building out their vision. Public Impact Opportunity Culture supported them with rethinking master schedules and assignments and time and all of that. And then Level Field Partners helped our districts do some cost modeling over the course of the year to work towards a sustainability plan for their small group support for students. So without further ado, I would love to introduce you. We have 2 folks with us today. We're going to start with Knox County, but Christine Pope from Knox County Schools. She is their curriculum specialist, tutoring coordinator, and can speak to everything that they did last year from beginning to end as they tried to make some of these moves. And then I'll introduce you to Rachel Walk in a minute. Christine, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you to everyone who is joining us today. I'm excited to share with you our walk and our work in instructional coherence and in tutoring here in the Knox County school system. So today we're going to start by just looking at where we started with high dosage tutoring tier 2 and tier 3 at the beginning of last year, and then how we took this information and moved into a small pilot in the spring, and then ending up with what we learned, what we're excited about, and where we think we're headed next. And so to set the stage, though, the Knox County school system has a little over 60,000 students and in about 100 schools, with 52 of those being elementary schools. And we're a mix of urban, suburban, and rural. And so we started last year, like many folks, using Ames Web Plus as our universal screener, and using those cut scores to place students in high dosage tutoring, tier 2 or tier 3 interventions. And so our delivery model that we used was a pull-out model where we had certified teachers and educational assistants working with tier 2 and tier 3 intervention groups. And then for our high dosage tutoring, we had uncertified staff who we had that fell under the classified umbrella, but they were serving in that role as a tutor. And so I think it's important for us it's important to point out that at a high level, our educators were working to place students correctly. They were looking at universal screening data. They were looking at structures, materials, assessments, and now high dosage tutoring. But we knew something just wasn't quite right. And so just continuing on with this slide, we see with content, we were using the HQIM, those high quality instructional materials for our core literacy and for tutoring. And then for tier 2 and tier 3, we were using specific programs for each of those. The progress monitoring that we were doing for tutoring was happening monthly with the Ames Web Plus oral reading fluency scores. And then for tier 2 and tier 3, also using those Ames Web Plus measures, but then also bringing in some program diagnostics. But honestly, with those, what we were finding is that a lot of folks were just unsure of how to use that data to best meet the needs of our students. And then finally, we had the collaboration piece where most of the communication was happening via email between our core teachers and our tutors for high dosage tutoring. And really, I think, to be honest, was a barrier, and for most of the year was a barrier in our tutoring. So as we move on, let's talk about what we did after our work with, or through our work with SCORE and the Accelerate Network. So we worked in the fall and really had the opportunity to learn about this concept of instructional coherence. And so from that, we developed a small pilot since this was mid-year. We had a small pilot that looked at instructional coherence. And so to start with, what we chose, or what we did, was we trained this group of pilot schools on excuse me, on the this tracker that we were going to use. So we trained these folks, and that included district support with our RTI squared facilitators, principals, instructional coaches, teachers, and tutors who were doing this, who were part of this pilot. And it was important for us to train them together, so that they were all hearing the same message, and they were all, we were able to address any misconceptions or wonderings in the moment. And so with the screener, or with the tracker, we gave the skill screener that goes along with our high quality instructional materials. And we use that to identify gaps and supports across the settings. We did not change the way that we were delivering our content, in that we didn't change the structure of when groups met or the ratio, things like that. We did, however, though, find that we needed to do some regrouping as far as our tutoring groups went and our intervention groups went. And so as far as our content goes, we continue to use our intervention materials, but we did use those HQIM assessments and that data to drive our decision making. So rather than just looking at that universal screening data, we were really looking at this tracker data to drive our decisions. And that came from our progress monitoring, where we were able to update that tracker along the way using the assessments that were part of our HQIM to inform our staff. And finally, there's this collaboration piece that really, I mentioned earlier, had been a barrier. And what we found with the collaboration was, while at first it wasn't pretty, it has developed in those, especially in those pilot schools, it's developed into a very fluid way of communicating between tutors, interventionists, and classroom teachers. So everyone knows, and that includes our instructional leaders, the principals, instructional coaches. Everyone knows what's going on and where the student is, what's being addressed, and what needs to be addressed. And I think that's a very important point or important part of this collaboration. So moving on, what are we excited about? Oh my goodness. We are very, very excited about the results that we saw, because what we saw was tutoring was, in most cases, the most effective support that we were providing for our students. And so we have seen that that importance of aligning what we're doing to what's happening in the classroom. And we've seen this opportunity for collaboration to occur. And that collaboration has not only been at the school level, but also at the district level. And so realizing that we cannot continue to work in our silos, that we really do need to be talking to each other, whether that's at the district level or at the school level. And so I'd like to spend some time on what we've learned part of our time together. And that is that we know that we should be molding our intervention to fit the student and not the other way around. It requires working together and not separately. We know that one size does not fit all. It never has, and it never will. And so it's so critical that we are thinking about what we're using and being very intentional in how we're using it. And so I think another part that's come out from this participation is that we, as on a global scale, that we have to be thinking about things differently. As a large district, we're making big small in the way that we support our students and the way that we support our schools as that's a goal that we are working towards. And that trickles down to how we're supporting our students. So we also know that in this global sense that we have to be thinking differently and asking ourselves, are we providing multiple opportunities for exposure, for practice, and connections throughout the learning that's happening? Two of our most impactful parts of this past year and a half with tutoring, though, have come from these last 2 points. And one is that that idea of intentionality. We have to be so careful in identifying who we are supporting and how we are supporting them. And that the use of the foundational skills screener that goes along with our HQIM and the tracker has really come to the top as an important, a critical piece of what we're doing. We have to be asking ourselves, do we need to give this child penicillin, or do we need to give this child a vitamin? And we have to be so careful that we're not giving them the wrong type of support. And the second really powerful piece that I want to point out is our community. So our community has played a pivotal role in supporting us in our goal to reach as many students as we can with during the day tutoring, or through our community partners in after school tutoring. So we currently have about 260 during the day tutors who have come from the community to work as as supports within our buildings. They come from a variety of backgrounds, from retired professionals. We have some retired principals working as tutors, engineers, nurses, to folks who are in college, some studying to be educators, some not. But they've all come together to support our students. And what the contributions that they've been able to bring have been so far reaching. It's not just the academics, it's the role models that they've been able to be, the relationships that they've been able to build. And as an additional perk to all of this, it started to feed our educator pipeline, as many of them have either gone back into the teaching field or are now in school to become educators through different avenues. So we've been thrilled to see that bonus of our tutoring program. So moving forward, though, we will continue to work on instructional coherence. As I said, this is a big district, and changing the direction of the barge sometimes takes a little bit of time, but we'll continue to work on instructional coherence, continue to refine our work around the skills tracker and the collaboration between teachers and tutors. And we're excited to see and continue this support for students in this very positive way. So thank you, Karen, for letting me share what we're doing in Knox County.
Right. Thank you so much, Christine. Everyone is only going to see my face for just another second, but I'm ready now to introduce our next presenter. If I can get my slides to partner with me. There we go. All right. Now I want to introduce you to Rachel Walk from Bristol, Tennessee City Schools. She is their supervisor of elementary curriculum and instruction, and has just been an incredible partner in this work. And one distinction that I will make between the sort of Knox County story that you just heard and Bristol's, Knox is bigger. Bristol's a little bit smaller. I would describe what Knox has done over the last year as really starting to implement new assessments, a new way of progress monitoring students and responding with intentionality to what they're learning. And then what you'll see from Rachel in Bristol is kind of a reimagining a bit of the school day and what it could look like. So just different approaches to getting kids more coherent support. So Rachel, thank you. And I'll let you take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Karen. And thank you for having me today. I'm excited to talk about the work that we've done here at Bristol City Schools. And like Karen said, we are a relatively smaller district. We have about 4,000 students district-wide. We have 5 elementary schools, and have really have a much smaller community than Knox County. But I want to begin by sharing our structure that we had at the beginning of last school year in the fall, and sharing about our high dosage tutoring tier 2 and tier 3 and what that looked like last school year before we began to shift. And we worked to shift our assessment, the content, the staffing, and the scheduling to better support our students. So I'm going to share with you the results of our sustainability analysis that we received support from level field partners as well. But what you see in this slide was the current state at the time. And in fall 2022, we really started thinking about instructional coherence. And in doing that, then we looked at our existing RTI model, which was tier 2, tier 3, and then high dosage tutoring. And how we were going about that at the time is that we were using our Ames Web Plus cut scores to place our students in all of those groups. And then we use the Tennessee Foundational Skills Curriculum Supplement here in Bristol, and we use the placement test to determine the groups in tier 1. So we group our students in tier 1 as well, based on the results of that assessment. Our delivery at the time was primarily pull-out, where we have our educational assistants across the district and in schools. They primarily supported tier 2 and tier 3, and our certified educators, they supported our high dosage tutoring groups. Then the content that we used in each of those groups were also very different. In tutoring, we used our TNFSCS, our HQIM materials. In tier 2, it was a mix. We used some of our HQIM, but we also used other programs that schools had available to them over the years. And then in tier 3, schools had more specific programs that they were using with those students. And then for progress monitoring, our high dosage tutoring assessments did align to TNFSCS. And in tier 2 and tier 3, we relied upon Ames Web Plus, and then we looked at that data every 4.5 weeks. The collaboration at the time was really just around tier 2 and tier 3 assessments. And we looked at the data points every 4.5 weeks at schools. And we did recognize and realize in the fall that we had to begin looking at collaboration, because as Christine spoke before, we were really working in silos between the tiers and tutoring. So we recognized that we definitely needed to shift. All right, so before we get too deep into the shifts we made, let me share a little bit more with you about the structure that we had in place of our core literacy blocks for foundational skills assessments, since this was really the key driver in the design of our instructional coherence pilot in the spring. So as I said before, with TNFSCS, there is a placement assessment that we give at the beginning of the school year, and we place our students based on how they performed. And in Bristol, we have at most schools 3 teachers on a grade level, and in most cases, there were 2 classes that were working at grade level, and then there was 1 group who was working on below grade level skills. So we felt strongly about following that progression and that scope and sequence that the program actually intends. But what we were realizing over the past few years since we began implementation is that we had created another challenge. So if you picture this, if we had our first graders, we had a class that was working below grade level. So they were working on kindergarten content, and our teachers were moving through the program lesson by lesson. Well, by that time they finished first grade, they had just finished the kindergarten content. So when they moved to second grade, we had to start them on first grade content. And then the same held true for that second grade year, so that by third grade, they missed all of second grade skills entirely. And then we were looking at how we were going to then not only teach the second grade skills, but also meet the third grade standards requirements. So this led us then into looking at a different approach. And what are we going to do with those students who are the furthest behind? So we developed a pilot alongside our partners. And in spring 2023, last year, we began teaching 2 foundational skills lessons per day instead of just 1. And we did that by utilizing our RTI blocks. And what we shifted and moved those blocks to back up with our instructional, our tier 1 block, which gave us more time. We also shifted to a push-in model so that not only did it increase collaboration, it also gave the classroom teacher more support. We used our placement assessments then to drive that support across all of the tiers and the tutoring groups. And then we implemented data skills trackers. And these trackers were shared among the teacher and the interventionist and the tutors. That way we were all looking at the same data. And the data in those trackers were directly from our high quality instructional materials, the assessments laid out there. All right, and then we needed then to look at scheduling in order to make all of this happen. So we asked our elementary schools to work with public impact over a series of coaching calls. And that's when we, started looking at making these critical shifts. So this is an example of one of our elementary schools, Anderson, and some of the work that they did with public impact. So their first steps were to evaluate their staffing and schedules, and they had to establish a vision for what that support was going to look like. They gathered baseline data, looking at those ratios of students to teachers and how they could use all of their staff. And then they looked at adjusting schedules and responsibilities. So they moved those RTL blocks around to match up with the core instruction time blocks. They adjusted their schedules to minimize the amount of transitions that students were doing during the day, because we also recognize we have to have the minutes in place. And then they also involved their related arts teachers to help support the small group blocks, and then identified time so that these support teachers could push in to help support that classroom teacher. This is an example of what a day looked like for one of our pilot programs. And you will see here that this, of course, is that group of students who is working at their earliest point of weakness. So they are working below grade level. And in this schedule, our interventionists, so our tier 2 and tier 3 teachers, pushed in to that tier 1 teacher's classroom to enable those students to receive a second TNFSC lesson each day. And we ensured that we stayed with the scope and sequence of the program. And this lesson was led by that tier 1 or core literacy teacher. With the interventionists, they were supporting in small groups. So you can see here then that, for example, on Monday, the teacher during tier 1 taught the first lesson, lesson 1. And this is a second grade group of students, and remember, they are receiving first grade lessons. So the lesson 1 is taught that morning. That afternoon in the RTI block, or following that tier 1 block, the teacher moves on into lesson 2. Then the next day on Tuesday, the teacher then teaches lesson 3. That afternoon or during the RTI block, then she moves on to lesson 4. You can see this way we were able to do 2 lessons each day, and then doing that for across, through Thursday and Friday, that enabled us then to double up. We put in there a flex day to enable the teacher to have a little bit of flexibility to gauge students and determine if there needed to be a reteach or a slow down or a catch up day. And that proved really helpful. But this, pathway really enabled us to provide students a way to catch up. And that's what we were missing before. So we are super excited about the results that we saw from our pilot groups last year. And we ran 2 of those groups, and the data showed clearly. And by May, the results were that those students, many of the students, did catch up. And now at the beginning of this school year, are on grade level. If they aren't on grade level, they are much closer. So we anticipate getting them there quicker this year. So we definitely feel like that the pilot worked for us. Now, given these results, we also want to understand how we can sustain this work and also then expand it. So like most districts, we staff by enrollment. So we know that with TISA, we really need to shift our mindset to staff around student need. And when we ran that model, we saw essentially no change to cost, but we did see that allocations did shift to different schools. So for example, you can see here that Anderson should have almost needed 2 additional staff members. And then the other schools may need to also shift staffing strategies to support students who might need additional help. If you look at scenario B, however, we wanted to increase our full-time equivalents, our FTEs overall, to support more students without dramatically increasing the cost. So we drafted here a separate pay scale for qualified part-time staff, and assumed that 1/3 of our staff would fall into that pay scale. So if we do this, then we can have an addition of 7 FTEs, and this would be approximately $130,000 a year, and then we could serve a significantly more amount of students in the long run. All right, what we're excited about, we are excited about the results that we saw with the students in our pilot groups. We are excited about the opportunities moving forward this year. What we learned is that we could create a really realistic pathway to catching up. And we did this by using the resources that we already had. We just looked at using them a different way. And with the support of SCORE and TNTP, we were able to think out of the box and exactly how to get there. We saw that our teachers, our interventionists, and our tutors, they all increased collaboration. And this really was enabled through those push-in models because they work together so closely on teaching those second lessons each day. The shared assessments, the data trackers, were vitally important here because that kept all of us focused on the needs and exactly which student needed what instruction or what specific strategies that needed to be used. And then we just believe now that we have found a sustainable path to move forward, and that we can continue now to offer this to all of our students. And so this year we have already started the work of the pilots last year at every elementary. We're doing this. We have 5 elementaries. So in each elementary, we are running this model in each of our first grade classrooms and second grade classrooms, because those are the classrooms that have those groups that are working below grade level. And that's the group of students that we want to ensure we're sending to 3rd grade ready. And like I say, very hopeful and confident that we are going to see the same results this year in all the schools. Thank you so much for letting me share with you today.
All right, thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Christine. I am going to jump us straight into some recommendations. Given everything that we've heard, I want to kind of reset this vision that we have for what we think is possible in Tennessee's next chapter. Again, with some pretty minor shifts, actually, because Tennessee has done so much tremendous work to get us to this spot. So thank you to both of our district leaders who were brave to share your stories and get us to this place. So we think the first thing is that Tennessee has a tremendous opportunity to just expand the vision for research-aligned literacy instruction. We have it in place. Let's make sure that the high-quality instruction materials and assessments that we have adopted are extended to all learners across all settings. And let's revise the framework. Let's think about these terms that we're using to clarify what's a process and what's a structure and what's the content and which staff. Let's revise that framework to think about some clarity of terms and next steps. And then finally, let's align the support that our state is offering to district supports, educators, and families to make sure it aligns to this new vision and framework, and particularly in kindergarten, where we have these early literacy screeners that we do 7 weeks into school, where students are assessed early on letter names, but those letter name questions on the assessment come before the instructional sequence actually introduces them to kids in core instruction. So let's really think about this alignment to the science of reading, to foundational skills, to comprehension, and also the sequence across the supports that are in our state. And again, we're just so hopeful because we have every foundation and building block there to make that happen. And then finally, while the recommendations in this report are really written to inform a state level strategy, we wanted to make sure that everything that's in there is actionable for districts and schools to start doing now, because you already have discretion under the RTI framework to look at data and as a team decide what is the right thing for this student. And if you believe that an instructionally coherent small group setting is the right next placement for that student, then that is something that's at your discretion. I've included the QR code here if you're someone who likes to immediately jump to resources, but I'm going to just walk you through a couple slides really quickly so that if you do choose to download these in the future, you'll feel oriented and it won't look like all new material to you. So when you open up this toolkit that we've created alongside the report, this is what the front page will look like. And everything you just heard Christine and Rachel walk through, this is what's in the toolkit. It aligns to their experience as a district. So this theory of change that talks about establishing the vision, which students, what materials, what supports, which staff, when, where, for how long, all of that. Like, let's get really tight on that first. And once you do that as a district, the next step in the toolkit will walk you through some staffing and scheduling strategies to think about some unique designs that you could do to really maximize your time and your staff during the school day. And then the third step that you'll see links to within this toolkit will allow you to do some of that financial cost modeling that you just saw Rachel walk through. So there is an Excel file that basically allows you to kind of plug and play different design models and calculates the cost for you to what it would take to get at scale. So as you think about the vision piece of the tools, there's an instructional coherent self-assessment that, again, each of these districts started out doing last year in teams to build a new vision. And then what could planning look like for an implementation of either a pilot or doing the work at scale? There's sort of two paths there for you to kind of think about as you access these tools. Also, you heard both of these districts talk, sing high praise of these trackers, these foundational skills trackers. So TNTP supported the districts in this network by creating a variety of trackers aligned to different sets of materials across different grade levels that we're making available on our site. for you to download and begin to use with students right now if one of these aligns to the materials that you use for core instruction. And then finally, again, these sort of different staffing scenarios, that inventory you heard Rachel talking about of how many kids, what's the ratio, who are my staff, where are they, what time do they spend doing different things, those kinds of inventory tools are included. And then this is just a snapshot of that Excel high dosage tutoring or really small group support calculator where you can plug in how many students at different levels of intensity of tutoring, which staff do I use, how much time are they spending, and how much is this going to cost me over the course of a year and per student. So I am going to turn it back over to Sharon. That's it, but I hope you found this to be informative and also to be really practical for things you can do next. So Sharon, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, and thanks also to Christine and Rachel. And I want to thank them for everything that they shared today on the call. And I want to thank our participants today for spending time with us, for the questions that were submitted, and for staying engaged. As we come to the close of this webinar, it's my hope that you're going to leave hopeful. There may be nothing that comes closer to an educator's heart than wanting to make sure that every single student, particularly those who are struggling, gets what they need to succeed. And when I reflect upon Tennessee and what we put in place as a state to make this conversation possible today, I'm hopeful and I'm really proud. Tennessee has a unique opportunity to rethink our processes, structure, content, and assessments to maximize our time with students and the amazing educators that we have in this state. And that opportunity is due to the innovative work of the last decade of commissioners of education and leaders across our state who chose to focus on all students, core instruction, high-quality instructional materials, foundational skills, and structures like small group instruction through high-dosage tutoring. For next steps, anyone or everyone who registered for this call will receive a follow-up email from SCORE that includes a link to the recording of this webinar and all the resources that we shared with you today. We also want to hear from you. If you submitted a question that didn't get answered, someone will respond to you within the next few days. Or if you think of a question later, please don't hesitate to reach out to us directly by emailing info@tnscore.org, and someone from our team will respond. Thank you again for coming, and thank you for everything that you do for students in Tennessee and beyond every single day.